At 9:40 in the morning on July 25, 1944, the natural world in a small corner of Normandy simply stopped. General Fritz Bayerlein, a man who had seen the worst horrors of the Eastern Front and the sweltering chaos of the North African desert, noticed it first through his feet rather than his ears. The birds, which usually chattered despite the distant rumble of artillery, had gone silent. Then came a vibration, a low-frequency hum that rose from the very bedrock of France, traveling through the soles of his boots before the sound of the engines even reached him. He looked up and saw the sky beginning to vanish. It wasn't a storm of clouds, but a storm of steel. Over the next 45 minutes, one of the most elite fighting forces in human history would be erased from the earth. The question we must ask ourselves today is not just how this happened, but why the Allied command was willing to gamble the lives of their own men to achieve it. Was this a stroke of military genius, or a desperate act of industrial murder that signaled the end of traditional tactical warfare? To understand the sheer scale of the catastrophe that befell the Panzer-Lehr division near the town of St. Lo, we have to look at the agonizing stalemate that had gripped Normandy since D-Day. By late July, the Allied invasion was, by almost every metric, failing in its primary objective. 1 million men had been squeezed into a narrow, suffocating strip of land barely 50 miles wide. The problem was the Tarantha bocage. For centuries, Norman farmers had moved rocks to the edges of their fields and planted hawthorn and oak, creating earthen walls 10 feet tall and several feet thick. These were not mere hedges. They were ancient, natural fortresses. For the American GIs, every field was a room in a house of mirrors, where a German MG-42 machine gun could be hidden in any corner. Progress was measured in yards and paid for in blood. Between the towns of La Haye-du-Pout and La Salle, the Americans were losing 1,000 men for every kilometer they gained. The psychological toll was even worse. This was a war of ghosts in a green maze, and General Omar Bradley, commander of the American First Army, knew his forces were reaching a breaking point. Bradley realized that the Allied forces could not simply push through the German lines. They had to shatter them. This realization led to the birth of Operation Cobra, but Bradley's plan was a radical departure from established military doctrine. He didn't want a standard artillery barrage. He wanted airborne artillery. He requested that the 8th Air Force's heavy bombers, the massive B-17, flying fortresses and B-24 Liberators, be pulled away from their strategic targets in Germany and used as a tactical hammer. The air commanders were horrified. These planes were designed to bomb cities from 20,000 feet, not to support infantry in a frontline skirmish. The margin for error was terrifyingly slim. Bradley designated a target box 5 kilometers long and 2 kilometers deep, directly in front of his own troops. It was a gamble of unprecedented proportions. If the bombs fell as intended, the German line would be vaporized. If they fell short, Bradley would be responsible for one of the greatest friendly fire disasters in history. Opposing this plan was the Panzer-Lehr division, led by Fritz Bayerlein. To the German High Command, the Panzer-Lehr was the teaching division, a unit where every soldier was a veteran instructor and every vehicle was the absolute pinnacle of German engineering. They were equipped with the latest Panther tanks, Panzer IVs, and armored half-tracks for every single infantryman. This was a unit designed to show the rest of the Wehrmacht how to fight a modern mechanized war. Bayerlein himself was a legend, having served as a key staff officer under Heinz Guderian in the invasion of France and as chief of staff to Erwin Rommel in Africa. He was a master of the war of maneuver. But in the hedgerows of Normandy, his brilliance was neutralized. By July 25th, his division was already battered, but it remained a formidable wall of steel. Bayerlein believed that as long as his men stayed dug into the ancient earth of the bocage, no amount of American infantry could break them. He was right about the infantry, but he had catastrophically underestimated the weight of the sky. The tragedy truly began on July 24th, a day before the main event. A dry run was attempted, but heavy cloud cover obscured the targets. In the confusion, some bombers released their payloads early, killing 25 American soldiers and wounding over 100. This should have been the final warning. The German soldiers in the target zone heard the explosions and watched the Americans pull back 1,200 meters. They knew something was coming. Bayerlein's men spent that night in a state of primal terror, clawing into the dirt, trying to make themselves small against the inevitable. Yet, despite the clear danger of another friendly fire incident, Bradley refused to cancel the operation for the next day. He decided that the strategic necessity of a breakout outweighed the lives of the men in the frontline foxholes. This decision reveals the cold, mathematical reality of high-level command in World War II. Once the machinery of a major operation begins to turn, the individual soldier becomes a mere statistic in a grander equation. On the morning of July 25th, the weather cleared and the conveyor belt began. First came 600 fighter bombers screaming low over the trees to pin the Germans in their holes. Then the heavy bombers arrived. There were 1,500 of them, stretching from horizon to horizon, creating a man-made eclipse. For 45 minutes, they laid a carpet of high explosives. The numbers are almost impossible to visualize. 5,000 bombs per square kilometer. Over 4,000 tons of explosives fell on a tiny patch of French countryside. The ground didn't just shake, it liquefied. Trees that had stood for centuries were pulverized into splinters. The very air became a solid wall of pressure that burst eardrums and collapsed lungs. It was, for those 45 minutes, a localized end of the world. When the dust finally settled, the landscape had been transformed into a moonscape of overlapping craters. But the physical destruction was only half the story. The psychological impact on the survivors was what truly broke the German defense. These were men who had survived the frozen hell of Russia, yet Bearline reported that many of his soldiers simply went mad. They wandered aimlessly through the smoke, their eyes wide and unseeing, reduced to a state of catatonia by the sheer volume of the noise and vibration. The teaching division had been taught that no amount of training could prepare a human being for the weight of industrial-scale warfare. This was no longer a battle between soldiers. It was a collision between a human army and an industrial factory that had learned how to fly. Bearline's own account of the aftermath is one of the most haunting documents of the war. When an officer from the high command arrived and ordered him to hold his positions, Bearline exploded with a mix of rage and profound grief. He pointed toward the smoking ruins of his front line and said that everyone was indeed holding their ground: the grenadiers, the engineers, the tank crews. They were all in their foxholes, mute and silent because they were all dead. He told the field marshal that the Panzerlehr division had ceased to exist. Only the dead could now hold the line. This moment highlights the total disconnect between the commanders sitting in bunkers maps away and the reality of the material Schlacht, the battle of material occurring on the ground. The German high command still believed in the primacy of the will and duty, while the Americans were proving that steel and fire were the only currencies that mattered in 1944. However, the American victory was tainted by the very same fire that destroyed the Germans, because the bombers flew perpendicular to the front line rather than parallel. The same errors that occurred on the 24th were repeated with even more lethal results. Dust and smoke from the first waves obscured the aim points for the following aircraft. Bombs fell short, raining down on the American 30th Infantry Division. Among the 111 Americans killed that day was Lieutenant General Leslie J. McNair. He was the highest-ranking American officer ever killed in the European theater, and he died at the hands of his own Air Force. His death was so sensitive that it was kept a secret for weeks, buried in a quiet ceremony attended only by a handful of generals. This irony cannot be overstated. The man responsible for training and organizing the entire American ground army was pulverized. By the very tactical innovation he helped oversee, it serves as a grim reminder that in the chaos of total war, the system often consumes its own creators. Despite the friendly fire disaster, Operation Cobra was a resounding success. The crust of the German defense had been shattered. On July 27th and 28th, American armor began to pour through the gaps. The bottleneck of the bocage was finally broken. For the first time since D-Day, the war became one of movement. General George S. Patton's Third Army was activated and began a lightning race across the open plains of France. What had taken 7 weeks of agonizing stalemate to move just a few miles was now collapsing in a matter of days. The German 7th Army was caught in a tactical nightmare, unable to form a new defensive line because their communications had been severed and their elite reserves, like Panzerlehr, were gone. The breakout at St. Lo was the beginning of the end for the German occupation of France. Looking back at this event, we must consider a section of history that is often overlooked: the psychological collapse of the expert soldier. Panzer Lehr was not a unit of green recruits. It was composed of the men who were supposed to be the best of the best. Yet they were the ones who broke most spectacularly. There is a lesson here about the limits of human endurance. We often think of elite units as having more grit, but Operation Cobra proved that grit is irrelevant when the environment itself becomes lethal. The German soldier had been trained to fight an enemy he could see, an enemy he could outmaneuver. When faced with an enemy that simply removed the ground from beneath his feet from 5 miles up in the air, the very foundation of his military identity evaporated. This was the moment the Wehrmacht realized they were no longer fighting a war they understood. Historians often debate whether the carpet bombing was necessary given the high cost in American lives. Some argue that the infantry could have eventually found a way through the hedgerows using smaller-scale tactics, such as the Rhino tanks equipped with scrap metal tusks to plow through the earth. But the reality of July 1944 was one of immense political pressure. The public in the United States and Britain was beginning to grow restless with the lack of progress. There were fears of a return to the trench warfare of 1917. Bradley's decision, while brutal and prone to error, was a recognition that time was a resource the Allies could not afford to waste. By sacrificing the lives of hundreds of his own men and thousands of Germans in a single hour, he saved the lives of tens of thousands who would have died in months of continued stalemate. It is a cold, utilitarian logic that is difficult to stomach from a modern perspective, but it was the logic that won the war. Another rarely discussed aspect is the failure of German intelligence and air defense. How did 1,500 heavy bombers fly over the most elite division in the German army in broad daylight without significant interference? By 1944, the Luftwaffe had been hunted out of the skies of Western Europe. The airborne artillery of the Allies was only possible because of a massive years-long campaign of attrition against German pilots and fuel supplies. The destruction of Panzer Lehr was the final result of decisions made in 1942 and 1943. It shows that battles are not just won by the soldiers on the field, but by the logistics and industrial output of the years preceding them. The German generals, for all their tactical brilliance, were fighting a ghost of a war. They were using 1940 tactics against a 1944 industrial machine. The aftermath for Fritz Bayerlein was a long road of rebuilding and subsequent failure. He was a man trapped in a cycle of annihilation. He would rebuild Panzer Lehr with replacements and survivors, only to see it shattered again in the Ardennes during the Battle of the Bulge, and finally destroyed for good in the Ruhr Pocket in 1945. His eventual surrender to the Americans on his own authority was an act of mercy for his remaining men, final recognition that the teaching was over. The lesson his division provided at St. Lo was simple and terrifying. In the age of the machine, the individual hero is obsolete. The story of the 45 minutes that erased an army matters today because it represents the ultimate expression of total war. It was the moment when the human element of conflict was almost entirely superseded by the industrial. We often romanticize the Second World War as a series of heroic stands and brilliant maneuvers. But the reality of St. Lo was a moonscape filled with men who had lost their minds because the sky had fallen on them. It reminds us that the true power of a military is not just in its courage, but in its ability to endure the unthinkable. The ruins of the St. Lo Perriers Road are silent now, but the vibration that General Bayerlein felt in his boots that morning still echoes through history. It was the sound of the old world being ground into the dirt by the relentless gears of the new one. Ultimately, Operation Cobra and the destruction of the Panzer Lehr Division proved that the Allies had mastered the most difficult lesson of the war: how to turn their greatest strength industrial production into a tactical weapon. The Germans had the better tanks, the more experienced NCOs, and the advantage of the terrain. But the Americans had the sky. By willing to risk everything, including the lives of their own generals and soldiers, the Allied command broke the back of the German occupation in a single morning. It was a victory bought with fire, a grim testament to the fact that in the 20th century, the only way to end a stalemate was to redefine the very nature of destruction. The men of Panzer Lehr were among the finest soldiers in the world, but as they lay mute and silent in the craters of Normandy, they served as a final tragic warning that in the face of total industrial power, no one is elite. This historical moment challenges our understanding of military ethics. We like to believe in clean victories, but St. Lo was anything but clean. It was a messy, terrifying, and tragic display of what happens when a superpower decides that the only way forward is through. The death of General McNair and the madness of the Panzer-Lehr veterans are two sides of the same coin, the human cost of a breakthrough. As we reflect on the Normandy campaign, we should remember not just the courage of the men who stormed the beaches, but the sheer, overwhelming force of those who came after them, carrying the weight of the sky in their bomb bays. The legacy of that July morning is found in the open fields of France that were liberated in the weeks that followed. The race across France, the liberation of Paris, and the eventual crossing of the Rhine all began in the smoke of St. Lo. It was a turning point that was as much about psychology as it was about geography. After July 25th, the German soldier knew that nowhere was safe. It's not the thickest bunker, not the deepest foxhole, and certainly not the most ancient hedgerow. The teaching division had indeed taught its final lesson. When the sky starts to vibrate, the war is already over. The silence that returned to the Norman countryside after those 45 minutes was a different kind of silence than the one Berline had noticed at 9:40 a.m. It wasn't the silence of anticipation, but the silence of a vacuum. A gap had been punched in the world, and through that gap, the Allied armies would march all the way to Berlin. The destruction of Panzer-Lehr was not just a tactical victory, it was a demonstration of a new reality. In this reality, the side that can produce 1,500 bombers and the fuel to fly them will always defeat the side that can only produce 1,500 heroes. It is a harsh, unyielding truth that still defines the nature of global power today. As we look back at the career of Fritz Berline and the fate of his men, we see a microcosm of the entire German war effort. It was an effort characterized by tactical brilliance and strategic blindness. They were so focused on perfecting the teaching of war that they forgot to look at the industrial capacity of their enemies. They built the best tanks in the world, only to see them flipped upside down by bombs dropped from planes they couldn't even see. The moonscape of St. Lo was the graveyard of the German military's illusions. Today, the fields near the St. Lo Perriers Road are green again. The craters have been filled and the hedgerows have grown back. But if you stand in those fields and think about the morning of July 25th, 1944, you can almost feel that vibration in the ground. You can imagine the 1,500 bombers stretching from horizon to horizon, a conveyor belt of destruction that changed the course of the 20th century. It remains a stark reminder that in the history of warfare, there are moments where the scale of the event is so large that it transcends the individuals involved. The story of Panzer-Lehr is one such momentous story of an army that was gone in 45 minutes, leaving behind nothing but a moonscape and a lesson that the world would never forget. The human judgment required to order such an attack is something we can scarcely imagine today. Omar Bradley had to live with the knowledge that he had ordered the deaths of his own men. Fritz Bayerlein had to live with the knowledge that he had led his elite division into a slaughterhouse they couldn't fight back against. These are the burdens of command in a war of annihilation. The tragedy of St. Lo is that it was both a disaster and a masterpiece, a failure of precision and a triumph of power. It showed that the path to liberation was paved with the same fire as the path to destruction. In the final analysis, Operation Cobra was the moment the Allies stopped trying to play the Germans' game. They stopped trying to outfight the Wehrmacht in the hedgerows and started using the one thing the Germans couldn't match: the sheer overwhelming output of American factories. It was the day the war was won, not by the bayonet, but by the assembly line. And as the survivors of Panzer-Lehr sat in their craters staring at a sky that had betrayed them, they were witnessing the birth of a new era of warfare, one where the birds would never sing the same way again. The consequences of those 45 minutes reached far beyond the borders of France. It sent a message to the German high command that their defense of the Atlantic Wall was a fantasy. It showed that the industrial might of the United States was not just a distant threat, but a present and terrifying reality on the battlefield. The race across France that followed was merely the physical manifestation of a psychological breakthrough that had already occurred in the smoke and dust of St. Lo. The war would continue for many more months, many more thousands would die, but the outcome was no longer in doubt. The sky had fallen, The world that emerged from the ruins was one where the machine had finally and irrevocably claimed its place as the master of the battlefield. Reflecting on this, we see that the story of Panzer Lehr is not just a story of a military defeat. It is a story about the end of an era of human-centric warfare. It is a story that asks us to consider what we are willing to sacrifice for the sake of a breakthrough. As we look at the silent fields of Normandy today, we should remember that the peace we enjoy was bought with the most violent 45 minutes in the history of the Western Front. It is a debt that can never be fully repaid. But it can be understood through the eyes of those who were there when the birds stopped singing and the earth began to shake. The lesson of St. Lo is written in the craters that have long since been covered by grass. A reminder that the cost of freedom is often measured in the weight of the sky. Bayerlein's legacy and the legacy of the Panzer Lehr serves as a cautionary tale for any military that relies too heavily on its elite status while ignoring the broader strategic and industrial context. They were the best teachers in the world, but they were taught the most brutal lesson of all by an enemy that refused to play by the rules of the past. The 1,500 bombers over St. Lo were not just aircraft. They were the physical embodiment of a civilization's will to win at any cost. And in the face of that will, even the most elite army in history was nothing more than dust in the wind. The story of that day remains one of the most powerful and harrowing chapters of World War II, a moment when the sheer scale of the conflict became visible to anyone brave enough to look up. It is a story that demands to be told, not as a celebration of destruction, but as a sober reflection on the price of victory and the terrifying power of the modern world.